I'm going to speak briefly about public policy development, and then I'm going to roll into what I would argue has been the path of public policy development around cannabis legislation. I think everyone understands how difficult developing public policy is in Canada, but I think anywhere. But in Canada in particular, because of the makeup of our provinces and the power that our provinces have, or in some cases provinces would argue the power they do not have. And I'm also going to speak just briefly about where I think we've come in the last 15 or 18 years when it comes to public policy regarding specifically, I see it says marijuana, but cannabis as well. I think when we consider where we are today with the marijuana legislation or cannabis legislation, I think we also have to walk back and look at what happened in 2002 when a Senate committee, special Senate committee was put together specifically relating to illegal drugs. And in fact, it was actually chaired by a guy named Pierre-Claude Nolin, who was a Conservative senator from Quebec, former speaker as well, who passed a couple of years ago. And their mandate was to look at illegal drugs in Canada and try to figure out where we should be going from a national drug policy perspective. Now, they went across the country holding town hall meetings, community meetings, I think 39 meetings in total, over 100 witnesses. And surprisingly, they actually came out of that with a recommendation, well, a number of recommendations, but a recommendation specifically to state that the government should make smoking pot legal and wipe clean the records of anyone convicted of possession, unanimously. Now, that was a blended committee, unanimously. They as well recommended that the Government of Canada should focus and shift its national drug policy, focusing primarily on harm reduction, prevention, treatment. And I would argue that they were influenced by actors at every level, but more importantly, we're trying to influence the government of the day, which was Jean Chrétien government, to try and make a dramatic shift from where they were to where they thought they should go. That day, I would argue as well that the actors, when it came to cannabis or marijuana legislation, were either at the legalization, decriminalization, status quo. I didn't hear people looking for stronger penalties when it came to cannabis possession, for example, but I did hear people, and at the time I was an assistant commissioner in the RCMP, I did hear people speaking about the fact that they were concerned about where our policy was at the time. Now, that would be a dramatic shift for Canadians in 2002 to go to legalizing cannabis, and in fact, the government of the day rejected it. At that point in time, 2003, in fact, the government of the day came out with a decriminalization of marijuana initiative. I think the Minister of Justice was Monsieur Cadell. At the time was suggesting 30 grams, and that was the dialogue and the discussion among health professionals, police, and even those who were trying to influence the government towards legalization, was whether or not it should be 30 grams or 15, as an example. It was anticipated at that time, and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police supported decriminalization probably at the 15-gram level, even though the government had pushed for something else. There was I think, an opportunity in 2003 for us to take Canada to a place most countries had not come. I know I used to work in the Yukon, and Alaska had decriminalization for a number of years prior to that, very successfully, and in fact had seen almost no negative impact as a result of decriminalization of cannabis products in Alaska. I thought it was a good place for us to be. I thought it was a shift in our policy. I think as well, if the government had pushed it through, I think the Canadian public would have accepted it. I think they understood it. The concerns they had then are not much different than the concerns they have about our present-day drug policy, in particular when it comes to cannabis, and that is the fact that people are criminalized for something that most do not believe is more dangerous than other things like alcohol today. I think there was a fear on the government side at the point in time where the legislation was actually being thrashed around. I was sitting in the Public Safety Minister's office giving advice, and I think the fear was whether or not Canadians would accept it running into an election not soon after. Now, so they actually withdrew the legislation, stepped back, and left it as was in 2003. So now we look at where we're at today, because really we saw almost no fulsome dialogue around whether or not marijuana or cannabis should be legalized or decriminalized from that time until about 2013, when the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and a police caucus within the Government of Canada came out and recommended that marijuana become a ticketable offence. Now, there was a number of reasons for that, but primarily because it was felt that the public were putting enough pressure on police officials in particular around cannabis legislation. Plus, we were getting pressure when it came to whether or not our current legislation was impacting on people's livelihood, their ability to travel, and often their ability to even enter educational institutions. So I think in 2013 we were at an opportunity, or had an opportunity, to actually make a shift in marijuana legislation in Canada. The government of that day, under Harper, would not accept that either. Even though, by the way, the police caucus, which were 16 former police officers, were sitting as Conservatives. So now we look at the current policy and what we have before us now, which is the legislation. The last election, the leader of the Liberal Party announced as a plank in his platform that he would legalize marijuana. I'm not naive as when you bring forward a plank and a platform and you win a majority from third party, it's expected that you will deliver on that platform. So it's no surprise that we actually have legislation before us legalizing cannabis. After the election, the government brought forward the expert panel, which included former Minister of Public Safety Anne McClellan, former Deputy Commissioner with the RCMP Raf Sukar, and a number of others who have an expertise when it comes to, in some cases, to be fair, interdiction of illegal drugs, but also when it comes to government policy. Now, they brought forward recommendations in relation to how cannabis could be legalized in Canada. Their mandate was not to determine whether or not it should be legalized. Their mandate was to develop or help develop a legal strategy. And they did that. If we look at what they brought to us, I think overall it's a fulsome piece of legislation. Those who have been arguing for legalization for decades would argue it does not go far enough. Those who have been arguing for decriminalization in many cases would argue that it's going too far, and those who argue status quo will never agree with this legislation. Based on the legislation before us today, I think access to cannabis will be primarily given to the provincial and territorial governments for their development. I think that's exactly the way we should go. I think that system of allowing provincial and territorial governments to develop their own legislation is the only thing that would work. And I think as well, most provinces and territories have identified that it will follow the similar regime to what they have for alcohol today. That they will, in some cases, whether it's a bud store or sold in a store which sells bud, I think we will see a system initially, at least in most provinces and territories. Some provinces are identifying that they'll go to local vendors, but most provinces and territories that will try to follow similar regime to alcohol, similar age limits, and some of the other regulatory requirements that we have with alcohol today. Now, some of the concerns that are being raised, and I think today it's in 5 committees in the Senate, and some of the concerns being raised are still being or attempting to be influenced by outside groups. We have provincial ministers, provinces, outside actors, industry, policing, health, all trying to provide input at this point to try and see whether or not this legislation, primarily through amendment, will be changed as we move forward. As an example, Indigenous communities, I think a number of the representatives of Indigenous communities and leaders who appeared before our Indigenous Affairs Committee identified that they would like the option to opt in or opt out. Now, whether or not that's directly through the federal legislation or through provincial or territorial legislation, I think was left out of the discussion, but I think that's the concern they have, is the ability to opt in, opt out. Now, I worked 19 years in the 3 Northern Territories of Canada as a police officer. At least half of the 16 communities I policed in had voted 70% or more to opt out of having alcohol in those communities, and I always felt that was healthy for a community to be able to do that in those cases. So I actually support that there is some form or manner in which a community, and in particular Indigenous community, have the ability to opt in or opt out. I recognize there are concerns raised legally around the fact that The Indian Act actually has the word alcohol in there. It does not have the word cannabis in the Act. I understand from some legal experts that there's a path to success when it comes to that, but I also recognize there are some concerns. Second area of concern that's being looked at right now is the personal grow or home grow situation around the 4 plants discussion, as most of you probably know it. I think most provinces have already indicated that they would support personal or home grow. Some provinces, I believe Quebec, does not support. I think one other province as well, Manitoba, does not support personal or home grow. I understand the concerns around personal home grow, in particular from a policing perspective. I also understand it from, and I've heard from condo associations, landlords around the fact that they're concerned about remediation of mold of multiple units. I've heard from one owner of over 1,000 units in Ottawa that are primarily rented into a market they don't totally control. In other words, they push it into a housing association who then control it, that they are very concerned about remediation of mold, for example, and the concern around illegal activity that might occur with personal or home grow. I would rather have seen this legislation push personal or home grow off, certainly inside residential, off for a period of time and allow us to deal with building a strong, regulated industry that's successful prior to allowing personal or home grow. I'm not sure that we'll be successful in seeing amendments go through when it comes to that, but I do know we're still getting a lot of pressure both at the committee and at the Senate level around looking for an amendment to personal grow at this point in time. I also am surprised by the fact that commercial operators haven't really stepped into that breach and having the discussion around the hundreds of millions and probably billions that they're going to and are investigating into the industry, and the fact that personal home grow could have an impact on that industry itself. There's also a number of discussions around personal possession, whether or not 30 grams is too much, not enough. I had a discussion back in 2003 with, I believe it was Minister Coder or Minister Easter at the time, around 30 grams and what it actually looked like. Versus the actual weight, more at the quantity and how many joints it could be. I'm less concerned about the number of grams, and I am more concerned, or I think we should be focused more on how it's packaged, what it actually looks like. If it's 30 grams in a bag versus 35 joints, there's a big difference. But we have thousands of cases that have already been settled in Superior and Supreme Court in this country around possession for the purpose of trafficking that are very clear in those cases of what possession for the purpose looks like. We don't have to make this up, and I don't think we need to develop it. I think you can look at what those cases have already said, and my recommendation to the Senate is that they would do that. The second piece of that, I think, surrounds price. I do think I would rather see the market dictate price versus the government dictate price. I think if it's a government-dictated price, it brings into instead how much taxation they're looking at gathering from it. And I think it will allow illegal marijuana or cannabis to continue to prosper, because I think the price they will offer that illegally would be very difficult for industry to compete with if it's set by government. I would rather see it be a market price running instead of that. I think access by youth. I have a concern around the access by youth, but it's different than most people have. And I gave a speech in the Senate and was questioned by one senator around possession of cannabis for someone under the age of 18. And the senator threw a question at me about, well, I grew up in Cape Breton, by the way. How did you get a six-pack of beer when you were 17 years old growing up in Cape Breton? And I quickly answered that my 21-year-old brother would buy it for me, and he did. And if he had got caught, it would have been a $54 fine. But in this legislation, if my 21-year-old brother buys a 17-year-old 10 grams of cannabis, it's up to 14 years in jail. A dramatic shift in this policy, which I don't think has been thought out. Now, I understand the rationale for doing that, because we're trying to stop trafficking to youth. I understand that. But I think there's a reality test that has to be put to this too, and I will be looking at whether or not an amendment identifying less than 5 grams, either it should be discretionary or a ticketable offense, and if it's 5 grams or more, that it continue to fall within the legislation, because I think it will find us severely criminalizing some people that in the past we probably would have not criminalized. I think the last area I want to talk about is I believe we will see more charges laid for possession of marijuana going forward than we do today and than we have in the past decade. And the example I typically give is that when I was a cop and I walked into a park and there was 2 guys drinking a beer and 2 guys smoking a joint, the 2 guys drinking a beer got a ticket and the 2 guys smoking a joint had it heeled into the ground because the amount of paperwork around marijuana possession was abhorrent. Whether it was completing the documentation for Health Canada and sending it away, and it was a criminal brief I had to prepare for court. So I would argue, we will see more people charged if the provincial legislation is as strict as most will be. We will see more people charged with possession of marijuana than we ever have in the past, except that it will be under provincial legislation and primarily ticketable. So hopefully the legislation that does finally wind its way through the Senate, and I'm sure with amendments, and finds its way into the House, I hope that it actually delivers on what the government's expected, which is getting cannabis products more likely away from young people and actually delivering cannabis to those who can make that decision and not involving organized crime. Thank you.